So this page is going to serve as a landing page for the material that we're presenting here today. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about the material that's actually on this page. A lot of it is also done in the Jupyter notebook. But if you want to go back and look at maybe other links, we have links to like various Wikipedia pages, the scikit-learn documentation, an overview of some of the methods that we'll be talking about today for dimensionality reduction, basic code, and then some other references that might be helpful to you. So let me take a look at this one. So for example, I thought this was a really good overview of dimensionality reduction algorithms, and sometimes it's helpful to just have it explained to you multiple different ways. So that's the point of the references, and that's why we have those collected on that main page. For now, though, we're going to go dive directly into the code. So to get there from where we are at, now hopefully that is a large enough font. We'll go ahead and click up at the top, go to code. And then down here into the dimensionality reduction folder. Go here. Perfect. And I'll post this link as well for anybody that's not finding it. And then into the Jupyter notebook itself. All right, thank you, Michele. Perfect, okay. So the first thing, and I think a very important thing whenever we're talking about new methods that people maybe haven't seen before, I guess I should ask, has anybody seen dimensionality reduction methods before, or like have you used it? Okay. Yeah, so it's a very good idea, I think, to motivate why we're actually using this before we even start talking about what it is. I find that I get very confused if I'm learning all of these complicated math concepts without understanding why we're going to use it. It can be very hard to figure that out after the fact. Another thing is we're not going to spend a ton of time diving very deep into the math here. We only have an hour, so I'm going to be giving you just an overview and hopefully a high-level understanding and intuition behind why some of these methods work. And then if anything really stands out, like, oh, that might be what I need for my research, you'll come back here, you can read our code again, and then explore the links that we've given, and hopefully it's just a good starting point for your understanding and your growth. So, okay, why are we doing this? So often we have data that's a really high dimension. So for example, consider the MNIST dataset. This is a dataset that's just these little grayscale images of handwritten digits that were taken from, I believe the Postal Service put this one together. So every single one of these is described by 28 squared pixels, which is 784 dimensions, just to capture this one little like handwritten digit. So that is just one example of how you can have really high dimensional data that's maybe describing something that's not really that complicated. And then we also know that data tends to have redundant information or strongly dependent relationships between different features within your data. So if you have, say, another data set that we're going to be looking at is a penguin data set, and one of the things it has, like, how much do the penguins weigh? How big are their beaks? How tall are their beaks? And a lot of these things co-vary because they're actually being driven by some underlying variable that is basically, you have this larger penguin, it's driving all three of those things to also be larger. So we might not necessarily need three numbers to describe that penguin when one number would suffice because it's driving the other three. So that's really what we're trying to get to here. We want to go from this high dimensional space that's hard to understand and hard to visualize. We as humans, we like to be in 3 dimensions because that's what we're most comfortable with. We can't really visualize above that. We don't have tools for it. So what we're trying to do is take this really high dimensional data and cast that down into some 2D or 3D representation that's easier for us to work with and visualize. So there's this idea of an intrinsic dimension to your data, which is just the smallest number of variables that you can get away with that well represent your data. And that's what we're trying to get down to. We're trying to just get rid of excess information and get down to that intrinsic dimension. Once we've done that, if we manage to do it, that enables us to do a bunch of different things. So we could do exploratory data analysis, which is just, if we get down to this lower dimension, we can start to visualize it and understand patterns in the data that could be driving just anything that we're interested in. We'll be able to start exploring it. kind of going hand in hand with that, we have visualization. So creating like 2D or 3D plots, visual aids based on this reduced space that can also help us understand what is going on there. Similarly, we can also do data compression. So the idea is super similar to if you have a picture that you want to send over the internet, but you don't want it to take up this massive amount of space, you can compress that down into a smaller representation, which takes up less space and is less computationally intensive typically to process. So, oh, I can turn my camera on. It's just not going to really capture my face. Okay. So there's two ideas that are helpful to understand when we are talking about data compression and helpful to understand when we're thinking about our reduced data in general. There's the idea of lossy and lossless. So if you have a lossless compression, what that means is you have reduced your data down to some reduced representation. It's been compressed, say from 7 variables down to 2, any number. And if it's lossless, that means that you can go from those 2 variables perfectly back up to the original 7 variable representation. When we expand that back out, there is no difference between how it was originally before we reduced it and now. Versus what's a lossy representation, which is, okay, we can go down to this reduced dimension, but when we try to go back up to the higher dimension, we do not perfectly get back the data that we have. We only get back some approximation of what it looked like before we did the reduction step. Typically, you're not going to be able to perfectly reduce the dimensionality and actually get lossless representations because it's just a very hard task to do. And then finally, one of the other things we can do with our reduced representation is actually feed this into a learning task. So we have some data, we've reduced it down, we've taken the dimensionality down, and now it's much easier to train a model or something on this. I know that I don't believe we've talked about neural networks yet, but in neural networks, there's this idea of the parameters that you need to train a network. And these parameters grow as your feature size, whatever's getting fed into your network, is growing. So typically, if you are able to reduce the feature size, you can reduce the number of parameters, which means that the network is easier to train, can tend to be more stable, it's faster to train, and you get a lot of benefits out of it. How much that matters with the smaller data set sizes we'll be using today, very little, because we have GPUs that are capable of performing like massive amounts of computation. But it is relevant as you start getting like into really high dimensionality. Has anyone here heard of the idea of the curse of dimensionality with respect to machine learning? Anybody in chat either? Okay, so the idea of the curse of dimensionality is essentially, as you go into higher and higher dimensions, your data starts to get really spread out. It's this idea of sparsity. You can have 500 samples, and while that might be perfectly acceptable if it's 2-dimensional, once you get to 500 dimensions, they're all really far apart from one another. And this poses a lot of problems for various computational methods that are used in machine learning. So again, like it's just very advantageous for us generally to try to reduce the dimensionality of our data when we can. So there are a bunch of different types of dimensionality reduction that we can do in our process. There's 2 general kind of categories that we'll fall under, and we'll focus on the first one today. These are linear methods, which involve somehow taking a linear projection of the data down into the low dimensional space. So the first one, and the one that we spend the most time on, it's definitely the most straightforward, but I hope that developing some sort of intuition about how this works can help when you're trying to consider other different methods and seeing how they're working. But this one's called principal component analysis, which just essentially is trying to extract some set of principal components that explain as much variation in the data set as possible. So with our principal components, we have a lot of variation captured, maybe not all of it, but enough of it that we're not losing a lot of information that is potentially helpful to us when we're trying to train a model or just look and see what the data contains. Interestingly, so PCA is a form of an unsupervised learning algorithm, which I believe you guys talked about this last week, just means that it doesn't need the class labels. It's just looking at the features and trying to reduce the fine principal components that explain variation in the features themselves. Does not care about the class labels. So in that way, it's different from linear discriminant analysis, which is trying to find basically within your data set, what are directions that will help me maximize the separation between different classes? So in this case, it knows about the classes, and it's specifically trying to find some lower dimensional representation where these are pushed further apart. There's something called singular value decomposition, which is takes all of your data and is trying to extract some values and vectors, which can be interpreted as, if you have this data and it's kind of in a cloud, the cloud can be circumscribed by an ellipsis, and it's just telling you, okay, the axis of the ellipsis in one direction is this, a second direction is this, a third direction is this. So it's kind of a generalization of PCA in a way. PCA works on fewer data sets than SVD does, but SVD requires constraint number of factors. I believe, I would have to double check. I haven't worked with factor analysis myself, but I believe with factor analysis, you can specify that you only want to see a certain number of factors and then receive that number of factors back out of the analysis. With principal component analysis, you can also, it will return, if you have a 7-dimensional set, principal component analysis, let me just open this up so that anybody in chat people in person can see what you're asking, this question here. So principal component analysis will return if you have 7 features, so a 7-dimensional, you can get up to 7 principal components out of it, but you could beforehand decide, well, I only want to look at the top 2 principal components, and if they don't explain enough variance, then maybe you would decide to reject it instead, or you can just use those top principal components as well. Yeah, so factor analysis, I talked a little bit about how we have different features that can potentially be varying with one another. Factor analysis is a way to try and determine if there's some sort of way you can reduce those to a latent variable that explains, maybe this latent variable explains 3 of your other variables. So you can reduce that down into the single underlying factor that's really driving the performance of what you're observing in 3 other variables. Nonlinear methods are more complicated than that. What these are doing is, rather than linearly projecting from our space down to a smaller space, there's a bunch of different things you can do. The first one, this one's going to have a lot of complicated terminology associated with it, called the T-distributed stochastic neighbor embedding, is basically going to try and say point-wise between all of your points, it will build a joint probability that it saw all of these points and their similarities like this. And then it will try to find a lower embedding space where the distribution that it got for all of these points is very similar in that low embedding space. That's all that the Kullback-Leibler divergence there talks about, is just saying how close are these 2 distributions if I were to look at them, and it's pushing those as close together as possible. This one is very computationally heavy. So if you have a lot of features, it's recommended that you just run PCA first, which is going to reduce the computational requirements for the TSNE. And then kernel PCA, this is an extension of basically kernel methods in general. What a kernel function is going to do is take your low dimensional data and project that into a higher dimension, but the idea is it projects it into a higher dimension where now, if you have, say, 2 classes, they're what's called linearly separable. So you can just put a plane and it will perfectly separate the 2 classes of data. And then in that really high dimensional space, it takes a PCA and goes back down to the lower dimensional one. So for the kernel PCA and the PCA and the LDA, we're going to see examples of those in the workbook. And I just wanted to give an overview of all of the different kinds that we have before going further into some of the specific ones. Please feel free to come back and read these again later. Pull it all together. So today we'll be working with, it's called the Palmer Penguins dataset. I like it a lot. It describes 3 different species of penguins across a couple different islands. So first, I'm just going to take a look at the data set so we're all on the same page about what it's doing before we start doing all of these dimensionality reductions to it. Very simple, we're using like common data science libraries here. And reading in the Penguins data set, we just have a CSV stored on GitHub that we're reading directly from using this. So using pandas, we can just take a look at the first 5 penguins. We can see that of our numeric variables, we have Coleman length, Coleman depth, that's basically measuring the penguin's bill, flipper length, and a body mass. And then quickly here, if we just run, these are like basic pandas methods that are just helpful for data cleaning. So if we were to run info on that pandas data frame that we have, it will give us some summary information about the data that's in there. So what we're looking at right here is just this non-null count. Please let me know if I need to make this text any bigger here as well. I'll go up by 1, I think. So that's basically saying, here's how many rows I have that do not have a 0 value or a value that is not a number associated with it. So we're just going to go ahead and drop everything that doesn't have that, has something that's not a number, because it's not going to be helpful to us in our analysis. Pandas makes this very easy. Okay. And then just another pandas method that we can run, value counts, to get an idea of generally what's happening with our penguins. So we can see that we have 120 penguins that are in the Gen 2 species on Bisco, et cetera, et cetera. And then as part of, we can do a little bit of exploratory data analysis right now, just to sort of try and understand what's going on in our penguin populations before we start doing any of the dimensionality reduction. So here, the simplest thing we can do is just say, well, let's just look at all pairwise plots that describe the penguins for all pairs of features. So for example, we'll be seeing like body mass to the culmen length, body mass to the culmen depth, etc. So here I'm just using Seaborn to create a pair plot. So along the rows and then across the columns, it will show us the 2 features that it's doing on the X and the Y axis. So when it's the same feature on the X and the Y, what it's showing you here is just a smooth histogram of where the penguins are falling in terms of the culmen length. So we can see this blue population of penguins has a mean that is lower than the other 2. And interestingly, we can also see that the green and the orange populations overlap. So there's no way to tell using just the culmen length, the green and the orange penguin populations apart. And then the other ones are just showing for an XY point here, we have this population of penguins. The blue population tends to have smaller culmen lengths when you compare to the culmen depths, etc. So one thing we're looking at here maybe is well, can we find a pair of features that just already can well separate out these different populations? Because if you have something like that, you might not even need to do any dimensionality reduction. But as you can see, for most of the pairs of features, we have at least 2 of the penguin populations that sort of just land right on top of one another. So for example, here, this pair of features would not be enough to tell the blue and the orange populations apart. So that's one of the things you can learn just by doing some exploratory data analysis. And now for our first method, principal component analysis. So the point of this is to pick out some set of orthonormal vectors, which is just a fancy way of saying all of these vectors are just mutually 90 degrees apart. And you're trying to pick them out such that they explain the most variance in that direction. So all of them taken together are going to explain the most possible variance of your whole population. Digging into a little bit about how that is done. So you have your entire population, and to get the first principal component, you fit a line where the line minimizes what's called the mean squared error to all the points. So the mean squared error is essentially just the distance between the line and the point, that distance squared. So we're dealing with all of these nice positive values, and then we take the mean across all of the points. We're minimizing that. So that's our definition of best fit. It's not the only one, but that's the one that principal component uses. So then once we actually, I'll show this as well. So for example, we have these 3 proposals, we'll call them, for a principal component. And from this one, it's clear that the third axis, if you were to project all the data down onto that, that would capture the most amount of variance in this data set. Because if you imagine all of these points being projected down onto this line, they're really close together. They're not as spread out as they can be. And that's what the third principal component, that's what that third line is getting you. It's getting most of the variation if you were to project it down. It's preserving as much of that as possible. So then for a 2-dimensional data set, we can gain at most 2 principal components. You can never go above the number of dimensions that you just have in your data. So the second principal component, we then have just one option that's 90 degrees off of the first principal component. So not super helpful. The visualizations are very good in 2D, but you wouldn't need to do the data reduction in 2D because it's already very small, but to help get some sort of intuition and understanding of it. We can take a look at these. I also really like, I found this Stack Exchange where somebody has this really nice visualization of the mean squared error. Okay. So here you can see this line, it's just projections of possible fits that you could have to this data. And those red lines from the points off to the line, that's the distance from the point to the line. So you're trying to take all of those and find whatever line minimizes the sum of all of those little red lines. So that's what the math behind it is doing. It turns out, based on some of the underlying math, that attempting to derive the principal components in this way is just the exact same task as finding eigenvectors and eigenvalues of the correlation matrix. So I thought it might be helpful also here to look at the correlation matrix to understand like why the principal components fall out of this. So from this one, we can see, if you haven't really seen a correlation matrix before, the idea is kind of similar to the pair plot where we're looking at the pairs between different features. So of course the Coleman length varies at like with a level of 1 with itself. Like every increase in the Coleman length is just an increase in the Coleman length. But what the remaining ones are telling you is how much they're covariating. So here we can see that Coleman depth is negatively associated with Coleman length for all of the different penguins. We see that the flipper length is very strongly positively associated with Coleman length for all of the different penguins as well. So looking at a covariance matrix like this is also considered a form of like exploratory data exploration. And if you wanted to, you can use code like this that's just going to print out like the lower half of the matrix. So we're not representing repeated information or information that's not actually helpful to us, like that something covaries perfectly with itself. But what we're seeing here is that there are large positive and negative correlations between a ton of the variables, which indicates that PCA is going to perform very well. If you are seeing that your factors do not tend to covary, PCA is not really going to be able to do anything with that because it's just going to pick principal components that vary along where your factors already are. It's not going to be able to find combinations of factors that are very useful to you. So that can be one way to understand why potentially you're getting principal components analysis that's just not explaining very much of your variation. So here, this is how using the scikit-learn library, we can actually perform the principal component analysis. Here we are importing something called standard scalar. And all that the standard scalar is doing is it's taking all of your data, it's shifting the mean such that the mean is on the origin, and then it's shifting the standard deviation, so shrinking everything basically such that the standard deviation is unity instead of whatever value it was. So we do that to our x variables first, which is the 4 numeric factors that we've been talking about, and then just use this PCA coming out of the scikit-learn decomposition library. This fit underscored transform is going to simultaneously derive the principal components and then transform your data into the space that the principal components define. So that's why we have our data X, and then we have this X underscore PCA, which is that process. And then here, I'm just printing out the first 5 values of our transform data so we can see that it's definitely been transformed into this other dimension. We can see that it is currently of level 4 dimension in 4 dimensions instead of in a lower level dimension. But what we can do is instead we can just take off the last 2 principal components if they do not explain enough of the variance. And then quickly to get an understanding a little bit more of what the eigenvectors are here. So just printing out all 4 of them. What this means is that the first principal component, the one that explains the most variance, is a linear combination of all 4 other factors. And it's going to, when you calculate the projection into the first principal component, the value is going to be for that penguin 0.45 times their length, negative 0.39 times the depth, etc. So it's just taking a sum, a weighted sum of all of the factors that you currently have, and so on and so forth. And then the eigenvalues, the magnitude of the eigenvalue tells you, gives you a sense of, is directly related to how much of the explained variance that principal component explains. So we can see if you just look at the magnitudes, it's not super helpful. You can definitely see like, okay, the first principal component is much larger than all of the remaining ones, and the first two would compose most of our explained variance. But then we can also just get that value as a percentage here. So we can see if we are doing just 100% times the ratio, which also scikit-learn is just calculating for you and storing in explained variance ratio, that we can see that the first principal component is explaining about 70% of the variance. So we've already captured 70% of what we can capture using just one component. If you add in the second component, that's about 20% more. So with just two components, we've hit about 80% of the variance in our data set. And then here, that this graph is just showing that in a graphical way. If we say, okay, if we have one principal component, we're up here at almost 70%. Second principal component gets us up to almost 90%. And then 3 gets us to above 95%. And then obviously, if we use every possible principal component, we can explain all of the variance in the data set. And here, this is just a bar graph that is, again, just showing, okay, if we were to look at the first principal component, how much is every one of our underlying factors contributing to that one? So we can see that the flipper length is most impactful on the first principal component, followed by body mass, etc. So we just have these for the first, I believe just the first two. So we can see for the second principal component, flipper length has like very little impact on that component. I believe that should say PC3, yeah. I'll just change that really quick. Okay, just quickly, because these are in a data frame, we can use all the normal pandas functions on them. And here, this is just some code. Now we're going to take a look at the actual dimensionality reduction. So we have a scatter plot. We just choose here so that we can actually print this 4-dimensional data set. We've just chosen 2 of the factors to plot. So we've chosen flipper length here and Coleman depth. You can see that these are not, the blue and the orange are not really distinguishable with these 2 factors. But using instead our top 2 principal components, we can see that this green one is still pretty far away from the remaining, and there's more separation between the orange and the blue. So they've been pushed further apart by the second principal component particularly. And then again, so just using the top 2 principal components, we can explain about 88% of the variation. If you were to do this like start to finish, you can take 2 methods here, which is, okay, I am just going to calculate all of the principal components and then pick as many as I need to explain enough variance. Or you could say, this is the amount of variance that I want to explain before you've calculated anything. And then I'm just going to have to pick as many as I need to cover that. So there's kind of 2 different ways of going about it. And then this is an additional PCA example that I just tossed in here. This is the one that I kind of used to learn PCA. It goes a little bit further into the math. So this one actually is going to calculate the covariance matrix and get the eigenvalues and eigenvectors directly from that, rather than using scikit-learn. So it can be helpful maybe if you want to just go a little bit further into the math behind it, not necessarily to like understand it though to apply. So here I'm just getting a copy of the MNIST dataset, which is being provided through the sklearn.datasets. There's a bunch in here, so if you want to go and find some more datasets and just practice some of these techniques, I would recommend starting by just like looking through and seeing if any of these catch your interest. Getting some info on it, we can see that there are 70,000 of these digits. I don't want to use that many. So what I've done here is I've just plotted the first couple to make sure that everything looks good, and then I can plot these out. And then I created just a small data set that's what we're trying to do here is we're just trying to see what could PCA tell us about the difference between just 3s and 8s. These look very similar. There's just a couple of different pixels that could give you some useful information about the difference between the two. So I'm just shuffling the data set and then taking 200 of the 3s, 200 of the 8s, and using that. And that's just to speed up the computation for this workbook. Okay, so I won't go too deep into this, but what you would need to do is basically, this just shifts the data so that it's on the mean. So here's the actual mean image, the mean of all those 3s and 8s. So we can see that like typically for both a 3 and an 8, we have these pixels that are being lit up very strongly. And then some of these that are not as strong because they're only turned on in the 8s. That's like the aggregate image of what the entire data set looks like on average. Here's the part that's going to calculate the covariance matrix and then get the eigenvalues out of it. I just wanted to show what the eigenvalues look like because I think they look pretty cool. So these are the eigenvalues that it gets. This is the first principal component. And you can see that it's picking up very strongly. It's kind of when it's taking an image and trying to take it into the first principal component, any pixels that are along the white area, it's going to say, if these are turned on, that's very important, and that'll be part of my output. And then for these ones in the black area, it says, if these are turned on, I don't care. I don't want them to be part of the output. And then the second principal component is it kind of looks like the opposite, which you would expect because these are trying to be orthogonal. They're trying to capture different features. So now instead of having this area that's lit up here and here, it's being downsampled in the second one instead. And then using those, I just projected the data set of the 3s and 8s down into the principal component space instead. And you can see that it is spreading out the 3s and the 8s pretty well. I also like this paper a lot. There was a very famous paper in the 90s where they used eigenvectors for facial recognition. And these are some of the quote unquote eigenfaces that paper used. So this is a principal component. They take a bunch of faces, they run PCA on it, and then these are the principal components that comes out of that you can use to regenerate the faces in that data set. Okay, so PCA is the one that we were going to go farthest into. So now I'm going to give just a quick overview and code example for some of the other ones, starting with linear discriminant analysis. So as I mentioned, linear discriminant analysis is a supervised machine learning method, so it requires access to the class labels, unlike PCA. But we can also use it. It's typically used for classification, so that's why I use the labels, but also you can use it for dimensionality reduction. So it's attempting to take your classes and find some sort of lower space where they're pushed further apart. And to do this, it's just looking for combinations of input features that, rather than explaining the most variance, are going to push the classes as far apart as possible. So here, rather than being in the decomposition library, we have it in the scikit-learn discriminant analysis library. There's also quadratic discriminant analysis, which you can look into if you'd like. But here we're just picking out, again, from the data frame, our 4 numeric values, scaling them down such that they are centered about the mean and have a variance of 1. And then for purposes of just showing the two side by side, we're going to fit PCA onto this again, and then also fit the LDA and compare them. So I actually also wanted to quickly let's see if I can follow this. Okay, there we go. So I just want to point out really quickly that I think scikit-learn has a really nice documentation system set up. So if you go through, you can actually read, like, this is pretty standard stuff. You can read about all the parameters of these methods and things. But then in the user guide, they kind of give you an overview of what linear discriminant analysis and quadratic discriminant analysis are, and go a little bit more into some of the technical details behind them and in what situations you would use. So I use the scikit-learn documentation pretty often for just getting some idea of what a method does before diving further into it. And I find it very, very useful for that. here. Okay, so now that we have fit a new model, both the PCA and the LDA of the Penguin data set, we can take a look at them side by side. And as you can see, the PCA, while it is pushing those classes a little bit farther apart, just based on the features themselves, the LDA, with the knowledge of the classes, is capable of pushing these like much further apart, such that the classes are clustered further away from one another. So you can see the red and the blue classes have been pushed further. So the singular value decomposition, again, we can use this for linear dimensionality reduction. Unlike PCA, this actually works pretty well with sparse data. So sparse data is when you have a lot of like zeros or null values for the columns. It can also be used for dense data. So PCA works really well for dense, doesn't work very well for sparse data at all. SVD can be used for both, but if you can use PCA instead of SVD, you should use that instead. And then another thing is that while the PCA, it works on that covariance matrix, the SVD is working on the data matrix, which is like a much larger matrix. So when you're doing all of the different matrix operations that you need to get the SVD back out of it, those typically scale poorly with size. So you would expect SVD to run slower. You might not necessarily see that in this case just because our data matrix is pretty small, but as you get to larger and larger data sizes, it will make a difference. So the new part of this code here is we have this truncated SVD method. Again, I just plopped the sci-fi or scikit-learn documentation in here so that you can look it up later if you'd like. And here it is required that you provide a number of components that are going to be extracted back out of it, and then used for the dimensionality reduction step. And then similarly, it has the fit and transform method, which will both fit the model and then transform the data back out into this X, which we are just saving as X underscore SVD. So here, because the data set is dense and it's just something that PCA works really well on, the truncated SVD looks very, very similar. This is not one of the situations where it works much better than it. So we're not expecting to see a huge difference. And then I just, for my own personal curiosity, timed it. So you can see that the PCA is also a lot faster. I mean, relatively. And when you get to like actual data set sizes, the difference will be significant. In this case, we're looking at 1.6 milliseconds, so not a big deal. But okay, and then the final method that I wanted to talk about today is the kernel PCA. So kernels and kernel functions are used as classifiers in machine learning methods. And what a kernel is trying to do is, maybe counterintuitively, it's taking your data and it's trying to project that up into higher dimensions, which for a data like dimensionality reduction seems a little counterintuitive. But it's trying to project it up using some kernel function that in that higher dimension is going to push the classes far apart from one another so that you can actually linearly separate them. So once you've achieved that linear separation of the classes, then in that higher dimensional space, that's when you would do a PCA and send yourself back down into the lower dimensional space for the actual reduction step. And then you don't need to do both the kernel and then the PCA. That is all wrapped up for you. And again, I don't think that the Penguins dataset is particularly good for this, so I actually went and got the example that they use on scikit-learn because it's quite good. So what we're doing here is we are going to make a data set that PCA is not capable of really making any headway on, but the kernel PCA can do quite nicely. And what we're looking at here are nested circles. So we have one circle of one class inside of this other circle. And if you're looking at this, it'd be hard to tell what kind of principal component you can cast this down onto, which could really make any difference in telling them apart. So if you were to run a PCA on this, we can see that when we do a PCA and then project it into the PCA dimension, we have just not made any difference to the structure of the data at all. Even in the PCA dimension, we still have these two nested circles. But the kernel method was able to actually pull these apart so that now rather than having these nested circles, we have one of the circles now in a very different location from the second one. One note is that there are a bunch of different kernel methods that you can use, which have various strengths. For this one, I just used what's called a radial basis function. This is really commonly used across kernel methods. So I'd recommend if you were to try to do this, go ahead and start here. And if you don't like the result, you can try to branch out and try some other ones. And then that's really the last one. Okay. And then this is the last one. So here, this one is also nonlinear. So kernel PCA is nonlinear. The T-distributed stochastic neighbor embedding is also nonlinear. And this one is probabilistic in nature. So the idea behind this one was that we were doing pairwise distances, deriving a joint probability from how similar we think all these data points are. And then in the low dimension, we're just trying to find some low dimension representation where we preserve that probability distribution as much as possible. In doing this, though, that probability distribution doesn't typically respect the density of where your samples land or really the distance in between them. So you're definitely losing some structure, which is helpful. And because of that, typically this is used for data visualization, although I think it's also used in image processing and NLP as well. So for this one, also, it's typically recommended that if you have a really large number of features above 50, you want to run PCA on it first, and then you can run the TSNE on that. And then here in this code, because we only have the 4 features, I didn't have to run that PCA analysis, but if you were to take this to a different data set, you would need to add that to this code to do the PCA first. And then here we can see that, yeah, the TSNE is actually underneath the manifold. And these manifold methods, which include TSNE, are also ways of doing dimensionality reduction in a nonlinear fashion. So if you want to learn more about those ones, this would be a good place to start. So here we have a TSNE of our penguins data set. And you can see that it's doing a pretty good job of separating out those 2 classes that tend to lie right on top of each other, the Adele and the chin strap penguins, with the exception of a couple down here, which I think is interesting. But again, so typically used for data visualization. So I'll stop at this point and ask if anybody has any questions. So one other thing I can show off. Let's see, yeah, so under the nonlinear methods, we have the comments on the manifolds. Oh, okay, never mind. Okay, so again, I can just give you a quick tour of the scikit-learn documentation so you can find a lot of these for yourself. If we head to the scikit-learn documentation, go to the API. On the left-hand side, you can kind of see these are all of the different modules. The ones that we've talked about today are mostly data sets where you can find other data sets for your use. Decomposition, so if you come here, you'll see PCA, the truncated SVD, and other generally would fall under the category of matrix decomposition methods. As well as the discriminant analysis, our linear and quadratic discriminant analysis. And then if we look out for manifold, all of their different manifold methods as well. So if you want to get even fancier than some of the methods shown here, you can poke around in their documentation. So if we were to, example, go to TSNE and then back again into the user guide, this can give you similar information. Just if you need it explained in a different way, the user guide is a good place to start for this as well. Okay, excellent. That is all that I have for you guys today.